Hi, everyone. Welcome to the Freight Market Outlook for January from Freightos. I'm Judah Levine, and the next half hour or so, I'm going to take us through our ocean freight and air cargo update. We're going to look at demand trends, other factors impacting the market like geopolitics, labor disputes, and how these are reflected in rate movements. And I'm also happy to be joined by Adam Lewis, who is the founder and president of the North American customs broker Clearit. After our update, he'll share his insights on the possible developments and impacts of potential tariff hikes, as well as other aspects of this developing trade war. So, Adam, if you're able to turn your camera on before we get going, maybe you can just introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about yourself and about Clearit as well.
Sure. Thanks, Judah. So my name is Adam Lewis. I am the founder or co-founder and president of Clearit Customs Brokers. And we essentially offer US and Canadian customs brokerage services to importers all across the globe. We make it accessible to importers all across the globe digitally. And we also offer freight forwarders as well as logistics providers a branded customs brokerage solution to offer to some of their customers.
Awesome. So, Adam, thanks very much. And we'll circle back to you after the update. And also, please remember, everyone, that we'll save time for questions and answers at the end. So at any point during our presentation or discussion, feel free to enter a question to the Q&A function. We'll do our best to answer as many as possible. Okay, if we start now with ocean and some of the key factors that have been impacting the market at the moment. Of course, top of mind for shippers to and from the East Coast up until last night, at least, was the looming January 15th expiration of the interim agreement between the ILA Port Worker Union and the USMX, which are the port operators. This January deadline was set at the conclusion of the 3-day strike that we had at the start of October, and that was after port operators had conceded to a significant wage increase of 62% over the life of the new contract. And they also set this new deadline in order to resolve the remaining issues, which was the role of port automation was the most important among them. So the USMX was seeking to introduce technologies or automation or semi-automations in order to make the ports more efficient, but that could also result in the need for fewer workers, while the ILA had rejected any automation or semi-automation that would eliminate jobs. So talks had resumed, but only very briefly before they collapsed in November. And there really wasn't a lot of optimism that even with talks scheduled to restart this week on Tuesday, that a resolution was going to be reached before the deadline. But first came reports that representatives from the sides had started meeting secretly early and on Sunday, and that those meetings resulted in the development of language for a compromise. And then Wednesday night, the ILA and USMX issued a joint statement that a tentative agreement had been reached for a new 6-year master contract. So this breakthrough ended the threat of the strike. It extended the existing contract terms through the review and ratification period, which is the next step for both parties. Details of the agreement are being withheld during this ratification process, but the sides did issue a joint statement. And the joint statement explained that the agreement is going to protect current jobs and establish a framework for implementing technologies that will create more jobs and modernize the ports. And there are some reports that added that the union actually won guarantees of the direct creation of new jobs linked to any introduction of new technology. A separate statement just by the ILA credited President-elect Trump and his support of the union for really this nearly last-minute breakthrough and protection of union roles. There had been a lot of speculation that if there was a strike, perhaps it wouldn't last very long because of President-elect Trump's significant support for the ILA, and therefore that the USMX was going to come under quite significant pressure, which maybe just happened even before that deadline. Besides the strike, the more or the next most immediate factor at play in terms of the ocean market is the typical pre-Lunar New Year demand. So shippers out of China typically pull forward orders that otherwise would have been moved over the 2-3 week holiday slowdown period in China over the Lunar New Year holiday, which starts on January 29th, a little early this year. And those 2-3 weeks worth of demand are pulled forward to the few weeks before the holiday start, which is right now. So we'll see shortly that Asia, Europe container rates climbed earlier than usual in late November and early December instead of December, early January, because of additional pressure on Asia, Europe shippers not to get stuck without enough inventory and then face that extra long Red Sea diversion wait time to get those shipments after the holiday. On the Trans-Pacific, though, shippers aren't facing those longer transit times of those diversions, and they seem not to have started the pre-Lunar New Year period early. But we do see that pre-Lunar New Year demand picking up just now in early January. As usual, we should expect demand to remain elevated after the holiday period a little bit into mid-February as backlogs are cleared of shipments that weren't able to get out in time, and then ease later in February into March with this typical seasonality. The other big factor, of course, for the container market, especially for the Trans-Pacific shippers, is the U.S.-China trade war. So Donald Trump had made campaign promises of tariff increases of 10 to 20% on all imports into the United States and 60% on Chinese goods. And since the election, he's announced intentions for 25% tariffs on his first day in office for all imports from Mexico and Canada into the United States. Based on the processes required for tariff changes, including those that President Trump used in his first administration, it might be unlikely that tariff changes could happen that quickly, although we'll hear more from Adam about what the possibilities are. And it's also possible that ultimately the tariffs that do get implemented won't be exactly like those that have so far been announced, but the likelihood of new and significant tariffs is quite high in 2025. And as we saw in 2018 and 2019, when shippers expect tariff increases, they rush to pull forward as much inventory as they can handle before those tariffs go into effect in order to avoid those higher duty costs, which we'll see seems to already have been a factor in ocean volumes and rates in the second half of last year. But besides those expected increases, sorry here. Besides the expected increases in possible nearshoring or diversification away from sourcing in China, there could also be retaliatory tariffs, which again Adam is going to speak to. But other wrinkles from trade tensions also include what we saw recently in Mexico. So since the U.S. And China trade war started during the first Trump administration, Chinese imports to the U.S. gradually fell, while Mexican imports gradually rose, with eventually Mexican imports replacing Chinese imports as the U.S.'s largest importing partner, accounting for 15% of all imports in 2023. At the same time, Chinese investment and trade with Mexico also surged, with more raw materials, components, and also finished products starting to move from China to Mexico, and many of those were ultimately destined for the U.S. market. In December, though, Mexico's president signed an act that immediately effectively raised tariffs on apparel imports to as high as 35%. It made significant changes to its MX program, which exempted importers of certain goods and raw materials from duty payments for those imports that if those were going to ultimately be exported to the United States, or usually for the United States. But both of these steps really create barriers to the use of Mexico as kind of a lower duty channel into the U.S. market, especially with MX being a big challenge for many e-commerce sellers who were using this this rule to import Chinese goods to distribution centers in Mexico and then shipped orders onto the United States, usually using the de minimis exemption. So we'll hear more about this from Adam as well, but there are a lot of different wrinkles and possibly a lot of ramifications. The other element going on just now or very shortly is that the ocean carrier alliances are going to be shuffled starting in February. So 2M is going to break apart, with MSC setting off on its own with its expanded fleet, and now it's the largest fleet in the market. And they're going to add more direct call services. And Maersk, the other former 2M partner, is joining with Hapag-Lloyd into the new Gemini cooperation, which is promising 90% reliability via a hub and spoke model, although there's some skepticism about whether this will be successful. And without Hapag, the THE, the alliance, those remaining members are being renamed Premier Alliance, and then the Ocean Alliance is remaining the same. So the initial rollout period, as we said, is in February. The rollout kind of adjustment period will probably stretch into March. This is going to coincide with easing seasonal demand, so it could be a factor pushing rates down if we do see some the alliance configuration creating some additional competitiveness between the new alliances as they compete for customers. The adjustment period may also mean an increase in schedule disruptions, though, as these vessels are being moved into place for these new services. MSC actually already announced a $2,000 per FEU disruption surcharge for transatlantic containers because of their kind of adjusting their networks. So we'll see what happens as those are rolled out. And then finally, of course, all of the above are still taking place in the context of the Red Sea diversions that have now lasted for more than a year, and they've kept rates at or above a baseline or floor that's about double the long-term average by absorbing significant capacity, not just on those diversion lanes, but across the entire market. Okay, so if we look at now ocean volumes, and we can see these trends that we just spoke about reflected in the volume and rate data, which we'll see in a second. But starting with U.S. ocean import volumes, and here we're looking at data and projections from the National Retail Federation. We see, again, in early 2024 start to peak season as shippers or Trans-Pacific or U.S. shippers were front-loading ahead of that October 1st strike. But then we also see that instead of an anticipated steep fall in Q4 with the early peak season start, expectations were an early peak season end. We see that volumes or the estimations are that volumes are staying quite elevated. So these were the estimations back in October, before the strike and before the U.S. election, and these were the estimations afterwards. And we see that the later estimations or projections were much higher than the earlier ones, likely reflecting that there was some pull forward ahead of those past possible tariff hikes next year. And because of the concern for the January 15th strike deadline, we can say that each of these altered shipper behavior and caused some of this front loading. And we can see that projections for 2025 as well through April are quite elevated relative to last year, likewise reflecting expectations of a continued pull forward due to the expectations of tariffs once again. Okay, if we turn now to see what this looked like in terms of freight rates, and now we'll start with, here we're in our Freightos terminal, and we'll start with Freightos Baltic indexed container rate data for Asia Europe, which is in pink, and Asia Mediterranean in purple. And we can see that there was seasonality, right, and kind of the typical seasonality of an increase before Lunar New Year and easing afterwards, and an increase around peak season. But we see that this was really skewed in terms of timing and in terms of rate highs and lows due to those Red Sea diversions. So we saw rates at the beginning of the Red Sea crisis spike and then ease after that Lunar New Year demand eased, but then settle at a floor of $3,000 or $4,000 per container, which is much higher than rates were in kind of slow season before Red Sea diversions became a factor. Then we saw rates increase early and to quite high levels, $8,600 per container to Europe in that early start to peak season, and then somewhat of an early end. And then we saw rates ease back to about that $4,000, $5,000 per container level once again. But we can see that carriers then succeeded in pushing rates back up since early November with GRIs, mostly on, as we said, shippers getting an early start on Lunar New Year shipments, as we mentioned earlier. And we can see rates continue to climb into early December on these lanes, that they've mostly leveled off to close the year and then to the beginning of 2025, though we've seen some attempt to increase those rates at the start of January just now as Lunar New Year approaches. But rates now are about at the $5,500 per container level, and that's about where they got to last year, at least for Asia Europe, on the Lunar New Year plus Red Sea baseline situation. There doesn't seem to be much anticipation that rates are going to go much higher There are reports that carriers are offering rates of about some carriers are offering rates of about $4,000 per 40-foot container starting in mid-January. And again, probably because shippers started early on this lane. And the anticipation is that rates are going to be easing even alongside reports of the start of some Lunar New Year driven congestion and equipment shortages, as well as some delays at hubs in China. There are reports of delays of up to 4 days for a berth at Shanghai, Qingdao, and also in Ningbo. And there's some congestion in the Philippines and Vietnam as well. Even so, again, the trend seems to be of rates easing because of this early start to the pre-Lunar New Year rush. Excuse me. There's also a factor of labor shortages and some strikes in some areas, also leading to some congestion and delays in European hubs, specifically in Hamburg and in Rotterdam. There are also issues in some ports in Spain and Italy. So these factors could cause some additional upward pressure on rates leading up to Lunar New Year. But so far, again, it doesn't seem to be significant enough to be impacting rates or pushing them up. Maybe it's keeping them more elevated than maybe they otherwise would be. If we turn now to the Trans-Pacific, okay, and here we're looking at rates from Asia to the U.S. West Coast in green, FBX01, and to the East Coast in blue. And here we see a similar story. We see Red Sea spikes earlier in the year, new floor set back in March, an early start and peak season with highs early in July and August. But then we see that compared to Asia Europe, rates stayed higher for longer. So especially to the US East Coast, and even once they eased more significantly in October, they stayed about $1,000 to $2,000 per container higher than they were back during this previous kind of low demand period. And this likely reflects, as we said before, that even once peak season demand was fulfilled, shippers started bringing in extra stock first ahead of those expected October strike deadline. And then after that passed, we again likely saw volume stronger than they otherwise would have been because of some pull ahead of the January 15th strike deadline. And since early November, also because of the expectations of new tariffs after the election. So we did see rates slide further from late November to mid-December, and that was right here. And that was probably because the arrival window ahead of the January strike had closed, so some of that pressure had eased. But from late December into the start of the year, now we've seen prices coming back up. Carriers have rise of $1,000 to $3,000 per container. We see rates now are at about $6,000 to the West Coast and almost $7,000 to the East Coast. These are already higher than we had pre-Lunar New Year last year. So West Coast prices are 20% higher than last year, and to East Coast is just about 3% higher. And this is probably because volumes are likely already a little stronger than usual on that tariff front loading. Some carriers are considering an additional GRI mid-month, but there mostly is some skepticism that would be successful that close to the holiday period. So we should expect pre-Lunar New Year demand in the coming weeks to support some rate increases, probably more for the Trans-Pacific than for Asia-Europe. And then we can expect rates out of Asia to ease with the seasonal decrease in demand later in February. As we said, for Asia-Europe, we could expect prices to fall back to that $3,000-$4,000 per FEU level. But for the Trans-Pacific, because of this continued front loading ahead of tariffs, that could keep rates from falling back to that floor that we saw earlier in the year of likewise like $3,000-$4,000. Okay, we turn now to air cargo. Here we're looking at the latest available data from IATA, which unfortunately is only from October. But we can see that there have been about 15 consecutive months of volume growth, which we can assume has also extended into November and December. 2024 year-to-date volumes, again, only through October, exceeded last year, January through October totals by about 12% and also set a year-to-date record for January to October. So volumes have been strong. And the biggest driver of the volume strength has been really that nonstop surge of B2C e-commerce volumes out of China to North America and also to Europe. Capacity has increased throughout the year as well, also reaching record highs. But even with this capacity growth, we've overall seen rates really just continue to climb or remain quite elevated because of this new e-commerce demand surge. So if you look at what that looked like in rates, So here we're back in terminal looking at our Freightos Air Index. We're looking at rates for China to North America in pink and to Europe in green. And we can see here that if we start with the Trans-Pacific, that air cargo rates climbed to about $5 or $6 per container last peak season, and then basically just stayed at more or less that level throughout the year. Now those rates, $5, $6, are prices we might normally expect during peak season months, November and December, and speaking in the kind of pre-pandemic terms. But we saw this as the new baseline this year, and again, this reflects that B2C e-commerce volume strength. So because e-commerce volumes had already been keeping space tight and rates elevated for so much of the year, there had been a lot of anticipation since earlier in the year that when we did get to peak season in November, December, we'd see rates really spike and space become very difficult to secure. But it seems that that anticipation led to enough strategizing and steps being taken ahead of time that this didn't turn out to be the case, at least not to the extreme. So carriers had shifted capacity to ex-Asia lanes. There was a lot of front loading, and there was also a lot of capacity secured in advance by shippers or by forwarders, so that you didn't have as much pressure on the spot market. And again, the peak turned out to be a lot tamer than a lot of us expected. So to start November, we did see rates climb up to about or up past $7 per kilo for China and North America, but they never pushed much higher than that, even in those first couple of weeks of December. And we see that now that air peak season has really come to an end. We see prices have come back down to about that $6 per kilo level from China to North America. But again, this rate is much higher than the pre-pandemic kind of low demand level, which would be around $2 per kilo. We saw prices see even less upward pressure for most of those peak season weeks from China to Europe. We did have rates push. Rates were mostly around $3-4 per kilo for most of the year. We did see rates push past $5 per kilo briefly in December, but now they've come back down to about that $3.50 level. And we see a similar story from Southeast Asia to North America and to Europe. If we look at them together, we see they moved in kind of a similar direction or similar levels as we got, at least in the second half of the year. And this is probably reflecting increases in demand for exports routed through Southeast Asia as well, either for e-commerce exports or other air cargo, possibly rerouting here because of the difficulty of securing space out of China. Though we see the trend was kind of less pronounced earlier in 2024, but then kind of caught up to those China, North America, and Europe levels by Q3, and have basically behaved similarly since then. We see some decrease after peak season. And finally, if we look at transatlantic rates, we can see that capacity shifts from lower volume lanes like this one were also impacting rates on these lanes. So there are shifts of capacity, or really freighter capacity, from lower volume lanes to ex-Asia lanes because of that e-commerce demand. And again, this is probably one factor that kept peak season from being not too chaotic. And it looks like that was probably a real factor in that aspect. But we can see that rates increase on those lanes where capacity was removed. So we saw rates get up to about past $3 per kilo, which is a 75% increase from September to that peak during peak season. That's the highest level since back in 2023, and that's 33% higher than last year. Back in December. But we also see that rates have eased now as peak season has ended. And it's probably too soon to think that freighter capacity was moved back. This is probably more an indication that some peak season volumes were also going through Europe, where if there was available capacity here as well, pushing rates up. And now that peak season has ended, those rates are coming back down. So in terms of air cargo and impact of some of the other aspects we were looking at when we looked at the ocean market. In terms of the lead up to tariffs, these will probably not impact air cargo volumes or rates as much as ocean because of the long lead time, or possibly long lead time that there's going to be to prepare for these tariff rollouts. And shippers mostly are going to bring goods in by ocean before the tariffs go into effect. But we may see some increase in air demand as a result, especially in the last few weeks. Or if it turns out there's a very short window before tariffs go into effect, it would have a larger impact. And again, of course, if sourcing shifts away from China, then we could expect some shift of volumes to those other lanes as well. Although we may expect that overall volumes will remain quite strong. But as we said, really the biggest driver of volume strength and elevated air cargo rates this year has been those e-commerce volumes, and the kind of the unusual use of expensive air cargo to move inexpensive goods is really largely due to savings that these platforms like those of Temu and Xi'an that they're realizing by using this fast air cargo and then de minimis exemptions in shipping directly to consumers in the US and Europe. These exemptions exempt those shipments from customs, from tariffs, and most importantly, from significant reporting or custom filings requirements and costs, which make this kind of make sense to be a quick cross-border way to directly to consumers. But this surge in e-commerce imports is facing several challenges in the US and in Europe. There are already signs that some Chinese exporters or US e-commerce importers or sellers are starting to build up inventories via ocean freight. As we mentioned, one avenue was through Mexico. There are other signs that some of that is shifting directly to the United States, which would reduce the reliance on air. So steps like these may signal that some preparations for an e-commerce shift away from air cargo is already underway. If there was something significant change to de minimis, if it was blocked or lowered to a very low level, that could mean an even faster shift. And with this, I think this is a good point to ask Adam to jump in and kind of share his expertise. So as long as we were already talking about e-commerce, maybe we can start with that. So e-commerce and de minimis, as we said, there are a lot of challenges, but we haven't seen any real changes yet. When or do you think there will be challenges? What do you think I'm sorry. When do you think there will be changes? What do you think those changes will be, and what is that going to mean for the market? So, are we seeing any changes on the horizon, and what do you think those might be?
Yeah, so we spoke about this. I guess it was in late September when the Biden administration made the announcement, and it's been relatively quiet ever since. There hasn't been any rule changes that have gone into effect, and generally, changes like this take about 6 to 12 months to actually take action. However, we do have an administration change, coming very soon, so that could change. But essentially, US CBP is looking just to have more control over what's coming in, and that's ensuring that importers are using a full 10-digit commodity code for importation. You see a lot of Type 86 shipments coming in with just 6 digits, and they're looking for a more robust or expansive item description. So, I see a lot of cargo coming in right now that has very vague descriptions, which actually in the last few months has actually turned into more and more inspections. So you have, US CBP actually leveling up their enforcement of Type 86 inspections, mostly due to these vague descriptions or on products that require CPSC certification, that Consumer Product Safety Certification.
I think it was back in the summer when this was first kind of, I don't know, coming to a boil, but maybe heating up. And there were reports that I think at LAX and maybe in O'Hare as well, there was 100% inspections of these types of parcels coming in. Were those kind of one-off things, or are these popping up from time to time, but they don't really we don't really hear about them? In other words, is this another part of this? Is it kind of also, spot inspections, maybe as a message that Border and Customs are taking this seriously, or was that kind of just a warning shot?
Look, I mean, it really depends on the port. You might have local port directors who are deciding to level up their enforcement. Some who are not. It's not across the board. So you might have, there are local port directors who can make the decision on their own whether they want to increase their enforcement or not. Because a rule change hasn't necessarily gone into place. So nothing has changed as of yet. But you do have officers or directors at certain ports who are saying, hey, it's time to start cracking down.
So it wasn't kind of an orchestrated across the board.
No.
Kind of step. This is more into individual places that are also taking steps. So, as I think I said a minute ago, we've seen reports or heard of increases in the use of ocean by Temu and Xi'an. I've heard of, we've certainly seen much higher volumes from China to Mexico, and reports of, a lot of that being e-commerce, which then moves on by de minimis into the United States. And we're going to talk a little bit about IMEX and U.S. e-commerce sellers who are doing that as well. Is this kind of a shift that's happening anyway because of anticipation of changes, or because of the fact that air cargo is expensive, and if you can go by ocean and then add de minimis anyway, we're going to do that? Or are these kind of the initial stage of this kind of low cost e-commerce directly from China that was by air cargo, and we're going to see a gradual shift towards more dual use of ocean and air?
Yeah, I think it's going to be a lot more gradual. I mean, part of the reason why this Type 86, de minimis explosion that we've had has worked is because of that kind of instant gratification that importers are looking for. This ability to ship low value goods into the United States has been around for a long time, but it's only really increased in the last couple of years as importers and individuals have gotten used to the fact that they can order something overseas for very cheap and receive it in the next couple of days. A couple of years ago, it used to be that if you were ordering something from China or anywhere else, you'd get it like 30, 45 days later. And the fact that they, have been able to shift to air cargo and start eating up air cargo availability has made buying overseas these, low value products a lot more attractive. I think that the shift to ocean is going to be, relatively slow. Especially they made the announcement back in September. Nothing's really happened, so I don't think there's been a big rush to start using ocean cargo to bring in this products. And LVS or Type 86 really hasn't had much reliance on container shipping in the past. Now, if you look at air cargo, once this shift does start to happen, as we know, air cargo is a lot more dynamic and responsive to supply and demand. So if some rule changes go into effect, that does make importing low value products either more expensive or more cumbersome. I think it might have a modest effect on ocean rates as we start to, as they start to shift reliance on containers. Maybe a little bit more so on air pricing as that availability increases with, fewer Type 86 shipments. But I think it should have a pretty minimal effect. In the short term, this might be a win for high value importers, who would normally like to use air cargo where it's been a little bit more expensive. But I think long term, the market's going to consolidate, we'll make adjustments, and things should level out.
Yeah, I mean, I think it would probably, as you said, it probably shouldn't have the biggest impact on ocean. It would just be, further ocean strength. But if it happens all at once, I would think that, it would be dramatic for air cargo. In other words, if there is some kind of like actually closing de minimis, or closing it to certain countries or certain types of goods from certain countries, I would think that could be dramatic. Is there talk of that? And you spoke about the Biden administration's steps that ultimately I don't think are going to go into effect. We're running out of time, and we're going to talk about Trump tariffs in a second. But the focus has been more tariffs. But is there talk within the industry about the Trump administration also seeking to close de minimis to a lot of Chinese goods, because it would seem right up their alley in terms of these types of trade barriers?
Yeah, I mean, look, what the Trump administration is talking about goes way beyond just enforcement of de minimis rules. With some of the tariffs that they're looking to put in place, you could see a closure of this loophole altogether. They haven't spoken much about that. It's been more focused on high value imports. But I mean, look, if they did decide to enforce this or close Type 86 altogether through Section 301 or however they decide to do it, they could do it relatively quickly. I mean, generally, like I said before, this process normally takes a couple of months to implement. But President Trump is very fond of this IE. I can't remember what it's called, but it's essentially the International Economic Emergency Powers Act, which will essentially allow him to make changes to anything tariff related almost immediately, by basically declaring an economic state of emergency. So, I mean, very possible. The focus and the talk has not necessarily been on de minimis. It's been on overall tariffs, but I guess we'll see come late January.
Yeah. So that really brings us to the next question. Let's talk about those tariffs. So, what are some of the expectations of the tariff increases? What would be their impacts? Who's going to be impacted? And first of all, just in your own opinion, how likely are we to see tariffs in line with what he's been talking about so far? So 60% on all Chinese goods, 10 to 20% across the board, 25% on Canada and Mexico. How likely, and again, in your opinion, and this is of course speculation, are we likely to see those come to fruition?
Well, look, I had been of the opinion up until Tuesday, actually, that this was more so saber rattling. We had seen some of this talk in his first administration, where he actually come into office and placed tariffs on Canadian steel and lumber, and that was actually very quickly removed. We saw that this was more so a bargaining tactic to renegotiate NAFTA. However, on Tuesday, I actually sat in on part of a webinar that was put on by the NCBFAA, which is the National Customs Brokers and Freight Forwarder Association, and we had some of the top trade professionals speaking to the potentials of Trump coming in, and what, as customs brokers and freight forwarders, we should be doing to protect our business. But actually, I still have some of the notes in front of me. What they were mentioning is some insiders are saying that Trump is looking to apply a 10 to 20% tariff on everything coming into the country, regardless of where it's from or what it is. A 60 to 100% tariff on any goods coming in from China. 100% tariff on any country that has abandoned the US dollar. And 100% tariff on vehicles made in Mexico. And the scary thing is that, if Trump does decide to use this, Economic Emergency Powers Act, this can be implemented without really any strict requirements. And it can be put in place, fairly quickly. Obviously, Congress would be pushing back on this. You'd have trade associations who are filing lawsuits. And, the timeline for implementation could be weeks. Nothing is truly immediate, given the fact that there has to be some sort of administrative readiness. So US CBP actually has to notify importers, make changes to their own internal systems to handle these changes. Or, if we have a big pushback by Congress, or we have some lawsuits put in place, there could be delays. But, insiders are saying that if Trump decides to do this, he's just going to try ramming it through using this Economic Emergency Powers Act.
So if we think back to starting in 2017, and we had these first round of tariffs with the first Trump administration, as you said, and now I can't remember the name of that act, but the kind of emergency measure, it wasn't used, right? So there were a couple other acts, and I can't remember the names of those either. But each of them had kind of pretty strictly delineated processes and kind of work in review periods. We did have a lot of different, as you said, trade lobbies asking for exceptions for different types of goods, and it ended up changing the ultimate outcome. But you're saying, so I guess my question is, if this was kind of at the president's disposal, why do we think it wasn't initiated last time?
Well, I think, in his first administration, this was really directed towards China. And, basically his feeling that China was, dumping low value goods into the country, and that was affecting our own economy. And he was looking to essentially build back up, manufacturing within the country. However, what we're seeing now is more of a nuclear option. So this is across the board. I don't think that, the impact would be so significant, not only on, Mexican and Canadian economies, but on the US economy as well. I think that if he did not use this the IEEPA, he would have a very tough time getting this put in place. Um, so, from what I understand, insiders are saying that he's very fond of this law or this loophole that's basically going to allow him to just, ram it through, without necessarily having the public comments period or, trade professionals getting the chance to review this process beforehand.
Yeah, so that would be a big change from last time. But again, if we use the first administration as an example, we did have the president announcing different tariffs at different levels, and I'm thinking specifically about, I think the most significant one was a 25% increase on a long list of Chinese goods that was meant to go into effect beginning of 2019. For the container market, we saw a big pull forward. We saw quite elevated rates, although they don't seem so elevated by today's standards, and really saw volumes shift. That 2019 volumes really get pulled forward into 2018 in a pretty significant level. But ultimately, I think those were not put into place in the same, as they were announced or intended to, as there came to be some negotiations with China and things like that. Ultimately changed. Why do you think there's less expectations that, as you said, these are kind of opening salvos for some kind of response or compromise for other things that the president wants this time?
I mean, it's hard to say. Again, this could be saber rattling. I was of the opinion that that was very much what this was going to be, and that you would have a lot of trade professionals in other countries, deciding to come to the table, with the U.S. and kind of cut some sort of deal. But my opinion has changed slightly. Just hearing some information coming from some insiders and some of the top professionals in our industry who are saying, look, don't panic. But this could happen, and as customs brokers and freight forwarders, we need to start putting measures in place to start insulating our own business. And that means making sure that customers might be on their own ACH account, so that they're paying customs directly. If you're going to see a quadrupling of duties in a very short period of time, making sure the bonds don't become saturated. But it's hard to say. Again, my opinion has only changed slightly because that of those insiders who do know a little bit more than me, and are might be a little bit closer to some of the incoming administration who are saying, yes, this is real.
Right. Yeah. So again, just a lot of uncertainty, and including the timeline of when things like this would happen, because really, as you said, the timeline is really important. If you have this longer runway, you have more time to kind of make those adjustments. And speaking of uncertainty, this will be our last, my last question for you before we can turn to some questions from our attendees. We spoke about Mexico a little bit before. We had this announcement of a big increase in tariffs on goods coming into the country, and again, I think the focus is on goods from China, as well as the changes to the IMEX program. So maybe if you could just give some more details on what each of these mean, and then we can talk about the implications.
Yeah, so it's important to know that this did come out as a decree from the Mexican government, which means it basically went into effect the next day. So there was no timeline for implementation on this. And it is temporary. So as of right now, this is actually set to expire in April of 2026. And it only affects, a small portion of product coming into Mexico. It's about 140 apparel items, which are increasing the duty to about 20 to 35%, as well as 15 textiles. That's increasing duty by about 10 to 15%. But more importantly, as you had touched on, it also affects the IMEX program, which essentially acts as almost a free trade zone. So you have international producers who are shipping product into Mexico right now, duty free, as long as it is destined for export. And they're essentially, and so this is raw material and unfinished goods. They're finishing it, exporting it. And, essentially it's, there's no duty paid, no administrative cost there. The changes here really, and again, they only affect the 140 apparel items and 15 textile items. Essentially, what it's doing is you can no longer import these raw or unfinished materials without paying these duties. Once it's export, you can file for a duty drawback and actually recover this. So it's more of a cash flow issue for producers, and will increase costs slightly because of administrative work in terms of having to do those duty drawbacks and recoup those duties paid. But again, it's only affecting a small amount of products. Mostly again textiles like coats, suits, dresses, and then bed linens, blankets, things like that. So it's not having a tremendous effect or a tremendous impact. But again, it's going to be more of a cash flow issue for those producers who are taking advantage of IMEX at the moment.
So it's not that long a list, but how significant is it in terms of volumes or dollar amounts, or in terms of the e-commerce aspect of this seemed to be kind of quite a recognized and used path? Is it really kind of much more segmented to just sellers of these types of goods, or was that a significant share of what was coming through Mexico?
I mean, look, it's significant enough that Mexico had to make significant changes, but I mean, again, it's only to a very specific segment. I mean, I don't think that it's going to have a major impact, on the price of goods. Again, it's more so becoming a cash flow issue, and a slight increase due to administrative costs. We're not saying that, hey, goods that are coming in, you got to pay all these duties and you're not getting it back. That's not the case. So I don't think this announcement will put too much pressure, but I mean, it remains to be seen.
Okay. Last two follows from me, and then we'll get to some questions. Some of this list where the rate went up to 35%, it had already been at something like 15 or 20%. And again, maybe because in actuality we're talking about kind of a narrow list and categories of goods. This wasn't so widespread and significant. But I actually hadn't realized that Mexico had such significant tariffs on Chinese goods. A lot of what we're hearing about this big shift in trade from China to Mexico was kind of this path to lower duty access towards the United States. Given the overall tariff regime of Mexico, overall it was still viable. In other words, you're still recognizing significant savings from a duties perspective for people who are taking that path.
Yeah, I mean, look, in terms of e-commerce, product was coming in to the United States from Mexico under Section 321. You have a lot of e-commerce fulfillment centers there, where it's not necessarily having that effect. But I think this actually stems from China actually moving more and more product into Mexico, and having their fulfillment centers set up there. North America, whether it's Canada, the United States, or Mexico, has relatively the same duty rates when it comes to apparel and textiles. It's usually about that 15 to 20%. So they had kind of followed suit between Canada and the United States. I'm sure that has something to do with the NAFTA, or previously referred to as NAFTA, or you can refer to it as USMCA or CUSMA now. But yeah, I mean, look, it's significant. But again, this is more so targeting products that are coming in that are destined for export. So
was there any talk of these steps as kind of a reaction to Trump's announcement of U.S. tariffs on Mexico? In other words, are these steps Mexico was taking to say, oh, we're kind of trying to align with what you're trying to do vis-a-vis China, and that is part of more leverage for their negotiations. I'm not sure I've heard that at all, but it occurred to me as a possibility. I'm wondering if in your industry anyone's hearing this.
Yeah, I mean, look, the timing certainly makes it seem so. But President Sheinbaum, when she came out and announced these, she basically said that she didn't mention the United States or
Right.
China. She basically said that these are protectionist measures and that they're putting it in place for a short period of time just to deter, kind of the dumping of low value goods into the country, whether finished or unfinished. But yeah, certainly the
Right.
timing, didn't help.
Curious. Okay, we have a few questions here, and with these we'll end. The first one is, can you expand on de minimis for a full understanding of the imports and what this means? So, Adam, I think that's up your alley. Maybe give a quick rundown of what de minimis means and why it's beneficial to importers or exporters using that exemption.
Yeah, so de minimis, which is part of Section 321 or Type 86 entries, what this means is low value goods, so goods with a U.S. value of less than $800 can be shipped to an individual or a company in the United States within a 24-hour period without doing a formal entry and without the payment of any sort of duties and taxes. So, as long as the value of the goods, and whether that's a single item or multiple items, in a package, are going to a single individual or a single business within a 24-hour period, you can import that product essentially without a formal declaration. So you're actually reducing or removing your brokerage fees in that case. Your brokerage, the declaration fee for a de minimis product might be something as low as like 25 or 35 cents, depending on where it's coming from. And again, there are no duties or taxes involved.
Right. And actually, this is something that I learned in conversations that you and I had. I think the assumption is, you're not paying tariffs and the savings are coming from that, but actually the savings are much more in the customs filings and brokerage costs. So as you said, it's something like 15 cents for de minimis. I think you said it's something like 15 to $50 per parcel. So that's really the big, in terms of the financial side, that's kind of the big savings by
Absolutely.
using de minimis, and also it's the speed, right? But things entering through the de minimis exemption, I think you said can clear customs in less than a week. And if you're trying to receive, e-commerce goods, as you said, we don't like to wait several weeks. I think the cutoff is like 10 days that we, want to see something that we ordered arrive. So it also facilitates that. Whereas, regular goods coming in that are paying duties take much longer to get out of to go through customs. Let's see a couple other questions here. Here's a question of what happens if the U.S. actually takes over the Panama Canal, and if tariffs are imposed on Canada and Mexico. So what happens if the U.S. takes over the Panama Canal? I have no idea. I would have to figure that out when we get there. But in terms of maybe at this point a more likely scenario where tariffs on Canada and Mexico do go into effect, if there is 25% on all those goods, what does that look like? In other words, we've talked about nearshoring, and nearshoring is to Mexico. If a barrier is put up there, what would happen next in terms of Canada as well?
I mean, there'd certainly be, retaliatory tariffs put in place. I mean, look, this could be if the numbers that we're talking about, if this actually does come into place, it could be pretty devastating, for not only the U.S. and Mexican economy, but for the American economy as well. American producers rely on raw and unfinished goods from both Canada and the United States, Canada and Mexico. And I doubt that either are going to kind of take this line down. If these tariffs do go into effect, we will see a significant rise in costs across the board. You might even see, I mean, maybe less so, but you might even see increases in the cost of power and fuel, materials, everyday products, consumer products. It's not something that would be good. That's for sure.
Yeah, and I think there's pretty close to consensus that the previous rounds of tariffs also kind of were inflationary in some way. A lot of that got swallowed up because they kind of went into effect just before the pandemic, and then we saw serious inflation. But it certainly makes sense that it'll be one component. If this time around the tariffs are that much more pronounced, I think we can expect that it would also certainly mean higher costs for importing businesses, and that would make sense that those get passed on to consumers. Okay, I think this is another one for you. In terms of de minimis, do you claim it on the shipment, or is it just based on the value of the shipment? I'm not sure exactly what that means, but maybe you do.
Well, it's essentially claimed on the value of. So the way de minimis works is you might have, a producer overseas who's getting orders, whether it's an e-commerce retailer or fulfillment, whatever it is. What they do is they're going to consolidate all of these packages or parcels. They're going to have they're going to have those parcels pre-labeled at origin. They're going to palletize everything and most likely put it on a plane or in a container. And we, as a customs broker, we're going to receive basically an Excel file that has every single parcel, identifying who it's going to, who produced it, a commodity code, and the value of each product within the individual parcel. As long as the value of of all the products within that individual parcel do not exceed $800, it can be, claimed as Type 86.
Got it. Okay, this is a more general question, and this is asking, what are we hearing in terms of in the industry regarding demand in the future? Are we optimistic about consumer demand, or is a lot of the strength we saw in volumes really pull forward ahead of some of the trade policies that we've been hearing about? And I think if we look at kind of retail sales for this past, for Q4 this past holiday season, what I've been seeing so far is kind of reports of strength, right? So if you're having that consumer spending strength, and really that's in North America, at least in the United States, has been sustained throughout kind of high inflation. The economy wasn't pushed into recession, really to the surprise of a lot of observers, or a lot of the anticipation. A lot of that consumer resilience seems to have persisted, and I think there is optimism for 2025 that will kind of continue in that direction. Of course, in terms of freight, of course, some of the volume strength we can attribute to a pull forward. But I think probably the year would have looked pretty strong anyway. Most of the pull forward that we had during the year was for this year on its own, right? Most of it was in North America was driven by those strike deadlines. It's only been really since November. Maybe some people who were anticipating a Trump win had already started kind of stocking up beforehand. But I don't think in terms of tariffs that as a driver really only started in the last couple of months. But again, Adam, as you said, if tariffs do get implemented quickly, if they're much, much higher than we saw in previous years, then it could very well be, have an inflationary effect, and that can start to impact consumer spending strength as well. Okay, well, Adam, I want to thank you very much for your time. You can, check out a lot of the data that we looked at today was from the Freightos terminal, and you all are welcome to check out terminal.freightos.com for that data and much, much more, as well as a lot of other areas of market intelligence. Adam, is there somewhere people can learn more about Clearit?
Yeah, certainly. On the Canadian side, you can visit clearit.ca. And on the US side, please visit clearit.com. Be happy to have you.
Okay, great. So Adam, thanks again. And thank you all for attending, and we'll see you next time.